esa Argentina virtual y mediática que planteó que odiábamos a las Fuerzas Armadas. Por Dios, nosotros, los peronistas, contra los militares, somos el único partido político vigente en la Argentina fundado por un general.
In the realm of politics, Argentina is something like a royal wedding for gossip columns. It's impossible to stop them from getting all of the attention and all of the headlines, and in this case, a ton of videos on VisualPolitik. And what can I say? It's no wonder. From a political standpoint, the case of Argentina is very exciting. That is precisely why, to date, we've already published more than 15 videos about the Land of Tango. Videos where we have talked a lot about different topics, but we still need to examine one of the most common political issues, trade unions, and their enormous power in Argentinian politics. In this video, we're gonna see how far the power of trade unions really goes, but first, we have to see where it all began.
Argentina and its dreams.
If an Argentinian is watching this video, it'd probably think that the whole history of trade unions began with Peronism in the 1940s. It's how the story usually goes within the country. Yet nothing is further from the truth. The history of trade unionism in Argentina dates back much further. To get a better understanding, we have to go back to roughly the end of the 19th century. That was Argentina's golden era. It was a contender to be the richest country in the world. Investments were pouring in, and millions of people chose this place to start a new life. In fact, during the last decades of the 19th century, Argentina was receiving the second largest number of immigrants, only surpassed by the United States. At that time, the American dream could be realized at the bottom of the continent as well. The Argentinian dream was real. And that's the time when trade unions first began to emerge. They were driven by the immigrants themselves, who flocked to the country and used them as a way to organize themselves in order to improve their living conditions in a country they did not know and where most did not yet have political rights. In this way, unions gradually grew and gained more and more influence. For example, in the 1920s, the country's economic strength, together with the demands of the trade unions themselves, led to the implementation of the first measures regarding the length of the working day, minimum working ages, and the rights of workers. However, the real turning point of this whole story occurred in the 1940s. On June 4th, 1943, there was a coup that would forever change Argentina's history. Shortly after the military coup, then Colonel Juan Domingo Perón was placed in charge of the new Labor Department. Colonel Perón had trained in Italy during the 1930s. As a reminder, that was when Italy was a fascist state led by Benito Mussolini. During those years, and amidst pizza, risotto, and spaghetti, Perón discovered just how important it could be to organize the labor movement from a powerful position. And that's exactly what he did. From within the Labor Department, slowly, without rushing, but with a consistent effort, he began co-opting the unions. It started with the smaller ones. He offered them benefits in exchange for commitments and agreements with the government, or rather, with himself. In this way, Perón built a whole network of trade unions that he effectively controlled and that were loyal to him. In fact, the more faithful a union was to him, the more benefits they received from the government. All this put Perón in a very privileged position. He soon became the most influential politician in the country. And that's what ended up taking him all the way to Casa Rosada, the Argentinian White House. Of course, when Perón became president, he pushed this political strategy even further until the majority of trade unions became part of the Peronist party itself. In fact, socialist or communist trade unions that refused to swear allegiance to Perón were persecuted, and on rare occasions, rebel unions were intercepted and came under official control. The message was, you're either with me or against me. If you swore allegiance to Perón, that was the carrot, and if not, you'd get the stick. And not only that, during his years in power, Perón nationalized a lot of companies and hired a lot of public employees with very attractive labor benefits. This was a process largely controlled by the unions, who were loyal to Perón themselves. They were his spearhead. For example, in 1955, when Perón himself was overthrown by a military coup and Perón and his party were outlawed, the unions became the conveyor belt of Peronist influence in Argentina. They became the main opposing force to the new dictatorship. A dictatorship that would, ironically, bestow on them their greatest privilege. In 1970, after a popular insurrection known as the Cordobazo, General Juan Carlos Onganía, who ran the country at that time, did something for the unions that not even Perón himself had dared to do. He granted them the administration of the Social Works Department, the Workers' Health Service. This meant putting hundreds of millions of dollars in the hands of Argentinian unions without any external control. Not surprisingly, it was precisely this move that made Argentinian trade unions some of the most powerful trade unions in the world. They were organizations led by an elite that became untouchable.
Perón y Evita vinieron a hacer algo histórico en la Argentina, que es darle los derechos sociales a los trabajadores. Y eso significó el nacimiento de las organizaciones sindicales, en las cuales creo profundamente.
The new monarchy.
Suddenly, Argentinian trade unions became very powerful instruments. They had political influence, a great capacity for mobilization, and they controlled millions and millions of dollars. Since then, their influence has only increased. To give you an idea, today between 17 and 20 million Argentines pay into and receive medical care from the Union Health Services. What's more, over the years, these organizations have extended their tentacles far beyond. Today, they even control hotels, universities, and media. This makes Argentine trade unions the most powerful on the planet. They've essentially built up an empire. But wait a moment, because all of this also causes some problems, and the fundamental one has everything to do with control. I mean, we're talking about huge organizations with million-dollar budgets that are managed with few restrictions. That means, if you are the head of a union, you become one of the most important people in Argentina. Suddenly you have access to a lot of influence and a lot of money. Everyone answers your calls. Everyone listens to what you have to say. You are practically untouchable. Many people that you have placed or promoted to different positions depends on you. And as we're going to see, everybody wants to do business with you. So the question is, why on earth wouldn't you make the most of it? In Argentina, trade unions have become like new political parties with exactly the same perverse incentives. You want an example? Well, look, the union leaders of most associations have remained basically unchanged for more than 30 years. Yes, there are supposedly elections, but of course, when you've been at the helm of an organization for so long, well, you control all of the buttons. This is exactly the same with governments, and the reason why many democracies have a limitation on the duration of leadership so that no politician is tempted to keep themselves in power. But let's look at some specific examples. There is the case of Ramon Baldacini from the Federation of Employees of Posts and Telecommunications. He was at the helm of the union for a grand total of 55 years from 1963 until 2018. Then there's Omar Viviani, the Secretary General of the Taxi Drivers Union. He's been there for more than 35 years. Amadeo Genta, the Municipal Workers Union, has been there 35 years. Guillermo Pereira, Oil Union, more than 35 years. Or Rodolfo Dare in the food sector for more than 33 years. As a comparison, these guys have been in charge longer than any dictator on the planet except Teodoro Obiang, the dictator of Equatorial Guinea. So let's hope he doesn't find out or will be packing his bags and headed to Argentina to join the trade unionists. And remember, these are just a few examples. In the end, it doesn't matter if the country, economic conditions, or governments change. The union bosses remain the same. In Argentina, it is common for these leaders to spend decades at the helm of trade unions. There has even been the case of union leaders who have handed down their powerful positions to distant relatives.
In Argentina, the parties, the business leadership, the armed forces, even the church have all changed. But unions have remained in the same hands 30 years on. How do they do it? Because they're functional to power. Even the military agreed with them. There was always a sense that without trade unionists, Argentina could not be governed. Ricardo Carpena, Argentinian journalist.
As you can imagine, all this has consequences. Trade unions cease to be plural organizations and become hierarchical structures. What's more, as time passes, things change, but these rigid structures can't adapt. And of course, in the end, there are so many vested interests that you end up not really knowing what or who you're defending. At this point, some of you might be thinking, but hold on, Simon, with unions so strong and so influential, Argentinian workers must be the most protected in the world, right? Well, actually, no, they're not. The country's constant economic crisis and out-of-control inflation rates have caused real wages, i.e. the purchasing power of Argentinian workers, to remain stagnant for decades. And what's worse, work is scarce, unemployment is high, and almost 40% of the employees in the country are informal workers. These are workers who have much less security and far fewer rights. So in other words, if we had to evaluate Argentinian trade unions for their results and their influence on Argentinian politics, I think the grades would be so low that they'd need to spend at least the next 10 summers having to revise to catch up. And look, let's take a moment because I know many of you are in favor of trade unions. I'm not saying that the problem is that there are unions, not at all, but perhaps having such a large structure that's so powerful, so fixed in their ideas and with so many vested interests makes changing course practically an impossible mission. Argentina is just a good example of this. But so much money and power in organizations like these also leads to other problems.
Ustedes lo saben porque además, como somos peronistas, creemos en la articulación entre el capital y el trabajo.
The big bosses.
Over the last few years, Argentinian trade unions have been shaken by a great many scandals. And now some of the mighty kings have fallen. This is the case, for example, of Omar Caballo Suarez, who was head of the Port Workers Union and one of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's favorite trade unionists. Caballo Suarez has been prosecuted for unlawful association, aggravated coercion, and fraudulent administration. During the investigation, many great luxuries were revealed. His home, located in one of the most expensive areas of Buenos Aires, yachts, cigars, bottles of champagne. Caballo Suarez was living the high life. Another example is the case of Juan Pablo Pata Medina, one of the former leaders of UOCRA, the Construction Workers Union. He was arrested in 2007 for unlawful association, money laundering, and extortion. It's estimated that in the 5 years prior to his arrest, he ran illegal operations that netted him more than $10 million between 2013 and 2017 alone. Real estate, expensive jewelry, this union leader even had a money-counting machine in his home, and lots of luxury cars. To give you an idea, during the investigation, more than 100 cars, $3 million in jewelry, and even a plane and helicopter were found. This guy looked more like a character out of Grand Theft Auto than a union leader.
It's called capitalism.
Marcelo Balcido, another union leader, this time in the education sector, was also caught. Detained in November 2018, he was found in possession of bank accounts and cash totaling more than $7 million. Among his assets were 2 aircraft, a yacht, several Porsches, a Ferrari, and a Mercedes McLaren supercar. The guy even had his own zoo and more than 35 employees at his service. He basically lived like a Maharaja. Anyway, these are just 3 examples from a very long list. Many union leaders used their positions to amass true fortunes and live like kings. And they did so for decades, with total impunity and while the country moved from one crisis to another. So unions can play an important role, but is it really a good idea for them to control that much money? Shouldn't the Argentinian government insist on more transparency and control to prevent all of this money and power being held by an elite? Isn't it time they did an honest self-assessment and recognize that the role of the unions over the past few decades has contributed to many of Argentina's current problems? After all, Argentinian trade unions have been fervent policy advocates for more taxes, more protectionism, and more labor regulations. These are policies that have done enormous damage to the country. So isn't it time for some change? And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. And don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.